No pressure at all, right?
Right, just incredibly intimidating.
Well,
You are there to help figure out how to govern artificial intelligence for the entire globe.
yeah, just a casual Tuesday.
Exactly. So you look out and you see policymakers,
Yeah.
civil society leaders, academic researchers, industry giants, basically the people writing the laws
Yeah.
and the code that will define the next century.
Right, the real heavy hitters.
But there's a massive catch. You have exactly 3 minutes to speak.
Wow. 3 minutes.
3 minutes. The clock is ticking. There are 0 digressions allowed, no time for throat clearing, and absolutely no room for error.
I mean, it is the ultimate pressure cooker because when a speaker is given an open floor, they can meander.
Yeah, they usually do.
Right, they can build a narrative slowly, layer by layer, but 3 minutes forces this kind of, this intellectual ruthlessness that most people, frankly, are completely unprepared for.
Cool.
You just cannot hide behind abstract theories when the bell is waiting to ring.
Welcome to today's deep dive. We are exploring this fascinating first-hand account published today, April 27, 2026, by Maurizio Rizzari.
It's such a great read.
It really is. We're looking at his unexpected experience at a UN informal consultation on AI governance.
Right.
And our mission today is to unpack how a strict, highly compressed 3-minute speech sparked this massive organic global network. So, okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
Because usually when we think of UN consultations, we imagine endless summits, diplomatic grandstanding, and just massive doorstopper reports that nobody actually reads.
Yeah, the classic bureaucratic black hole. And that is precisely why this account is so valuable for us to examine today. I mean, everyone is talking about AI policy right now, and the noise is just deafening.
It's everywhere. You can't escape it.
Exactly. But finding out what actually happens in the rooms where global policy is drafted, the actual mechanics of how those conversations operate, is incredibly rare. So for anyone listening who's trying to stay well-informed without, drowning in the information overload of the daily tech news cycle, we basically get to see the machinery of governance in action.
And the machinery, in this case, was operating under severe constraints.
Yeah.
Rizzari lays out the structure of this UN consultation. There were 4 thematic clusters, and every single speaker was limited to a strict 3-minute intervention.
3 minutes is just brutal.
It's like speed dating for global policy. He actually notes that his entire preparation strategy was just to deliver a concrete contribution, aligned perfectly with the concept note, and above all else, respect that clock.
Which, is incredibly difficult in practice. We are dealing with global AI governance here. That encompasses sovereign rights, corporate intellectual property, borderless data flows, rapidly evolving neural networks. Just distilling the architecture of all of that into 180 seconds is a monumental task.
Well, I have to push back on the format itself before we even get into what he actually said, because you just listed off incredibly dense structural issues. Yeah, massive issues.
Right. So is a 3-minute time limit actually conducive to solving any of that? Because from the outside, this sounds like bureaucratic theater.
I can totally see why you'd say that.
It just sounds like a way for the UN to process hundreds of speakers, stamp a document saying we consulted the global community, without actually having to engage deeply with any single complex argument.
Right. It is so easy to view it cynically. But what's fascinating here is that extreme constraints actually force extreme clarity.
Okay, how so?
Well, when people have 45 minutes to talk about AI policy, they tend to hide behind a shield of jargon. They use buzzwords, they hypothesize about crazy science fiction scenarios.
Terminator robots taking over, right?
Exactly. And they bury the actual operational mechanisms. But when you only have 3 minutes, you have to strip all of that away. You are forced to distill your absolute core thesis.
Because there's just no time for the fluff.
Exactly. If a speaker doesn't have a clear, actionable framework, the whole room will know instantly. The fluff becomes incredibly obvious when time is scarce. So the format basically filters out the noise by default.
It really does. And Rizzari notes in his piece that he realized he hadn't fully accounted for 2 massive variables going into the specific room. First, the incredibly high quality of the voices present.
Right. These aren't just random people.
No, these weren't casual observers. They were highly informed stakeholders who could instantly separate operational substance from diplomatic fluff. And second, he didn't anticipate this desperate, underlying hunger for continuity among the attendees.
Meaning they wanted something real to take home.
Yes. They were looking for a concrete methodology they could actually take back to their respective countries and organizations.
And that need to distill a massive topic into a tiny window perfectly sets up the specific, highly focused lens that Rizzari chose to present. Because he didn't, try to solve all of AI in 3 minutes.
It'd be impossible.
Right. He brought a very specific operational framework to the microphone, which he calls the conscious data life cycle.
Or the aware life cycle of data.
Exactly. And he argued that AI governance cannot be limited merely to the AI model itself. It must extend to the entire life cycle of the data surrounding the model, placing AI within what he terms a trust perimeter.
And that phrase right there, trust perimeter, is the hinge of his entire argument.
Yeah, let's unpack that.
Because for the last few years, almost all public anxiety and regulatory focus has been obsessively fixed on the AI models themselves. The parameters, the neural network weights, the specific outputs of the machine.
Like, what did ChatGPT just say to me?
Right, exactly. The model has been treated as the sole object of governance. But Rizzari shifts the focus entirely. He's arguing that the model is just a single processing point in a much larger chain of events.
Okay, let me give an analogy for you listening to make this concrete. Focusing only on the AI model is like health inspectors only looking at a restaurant's final plated dish.
Oh, that's a great way to put it.
Right. While completely ignoring the farm where the ingredients were grown or how they were transported and like how long they sat in the fridge before cooking.
Exactly. If we connect this to the bigger picture, the reason this resonated so well is that it moves from just acknowledging the problem to actually providing an operational, verifiable mechanism.
Because we all know garbage in, garbage out. Right.
Right. That's computer science 101. But he broke this life cycle down into 4 distinct governable dimensions: creation, usability, persistence, and reuse. He wasn't just telling the UN that data is important, he was giving them a map to regulate it.
Let's break down the mechanics of those 4 dimensions because that is where the actual governance happens. The first dimension he presented is creation.
Yeah, and in a governance context, creation is all about provenance and cryptographic certainty.
Okay, meaning what exactly?
Meaning, when a piece of data is generated, whether it's user input, a sensor reading, a scraped document governing its creation means logging the precise context of its birth, who generated it, under what jurisdiction.
Did the creator attach specific licensing restrictions?
Right, or consent parameters at the exact moment of inception. Because without governing creation, everything downstream is legally and operationally compromised.
That makes total sense. So
Yeah.
The second dimension is usability. And I imagine this isn't just about whether a file format is readable.
No, not at all. Usability in the conscious data lifecycle refers to access controls, interoperability, and the structural integrity of the data as it moves through different systems.
So who is allowed to touch it?
Exactly. Can this data be legally and technically utilized by a secondary system without violating the terms of its creation? It defines the boundaries of how data interacts with the AI model.
Like, is this data structured in a way that allows a regulatory body to actually audit how it's being used in real time?
Bingo. Which brings us to the third dimension, persistence.
And here is where I really want to challenge this framework.
Yeah.
Because we are talking about global UN policy. You have the European Union enforcing strict data minimization under GDPR,
Right.
Forcing companies to delete data.
Right.
But meanwhile, you have massive tech conglomerates in the U.S. and state-sponsored systems in China whose underlying architectures rely on indefinite data accumulation. They just hoard it.
Yeah, it's a completely different philosophy.
So how can a framework govern persistence globally when the geopolitical laws regarding data retention are frankly fundamentally at war with each other?
Well, that is the exact tension the framework addresses. The conscious data lifecycle doesn't magically rewrite local laws.
Okay.
Instead, it provides the technical and operational perimeter required to enforce whichever law applies. Persistence is about time-to-live metrics and geographical residency.
Just tracking it.
Exactly.
Yeah.
If a European citizen's data enters a U.S.-trained AI model, governing persistence means the system has a verifiable mechanism to track how long that data lives in the model's architecture, and a mechanism to excise it when the legal time limit expires.
Oh, wow. So Rizzari's framework allows a company to prove to regulators that they are actively managing the persistence of data, rather than just letting it vanish into a black box.
Precisely. It's about creating an auditable trail. And that leads directly to the fourth dimension, which is reuse.
Reuse.
And reuse is arguably the most critical dimension for the future of AI.
Because AI models are feeding on each other now.
Exactly. When an AI model generates an output, that output often becomes training data for the next generation of models. We see this with synthetic data generation all the time.
Right.
So governing reuse means tracing the digital DNA of a dataset even after it has been ingested, transformed, and spit out by a tertiary model.
And if you don't do that?
If you don't govern reuse, you suffer from model collapse. And you completely lose the ability to track intellectual property or user consent once the data has gone through a few cycles of machine learning.
Hearing you break down creation, usability, persistence, and reuse, I can totally see why this resonated so heavily with the UN delegates. I mean, it takes this abstract fear of an omnipotent AI model and breaks it down into, like, governable operational stages. A corporate lawyer can look at this framework and focus on persistence to manage liability. A developer can focus on usability.
And a human rights advocate can focus on creation and consent. It creates a shared language. It bridges the gap between the politicians writing the policies and the engineers building the data pipelines.
Yeah.
By proposing a trust perimeter that encompasses the entire life cycle, Rizzari offered a blueprint that works regardless of which specific regulatory cluster a delegate belonged to.
And that shared language is what triggered the aftermath of his speech. Because here's where it gets really interesting. You deliver a highly technical 3-minute pitch, the bell rings, you sit down.
Yeah, and usually you just go get coffee.
Right. In most conferences, you assume it's over. But Rizzari writes that after his intervention, the response he received was entirely disproportionate to his speaking time.
It blew up.
He experienced a constant, overwhelming flow of messages from governments, civil society, academia, industry.
The diversity of the people reaching out to him is the key indicator here. We aren't talking about a few polite networking messages from peers in his specific sector. This was widespread.
Yeah, and every single message, regardless of whether it came from a state official or an industry leader, had the exact same implicit question. Like, how do we keep this dialogue alive?
They needed more than 3 minutes.
They explicitly told him that the UN format was too brief. They felt the constraint of the environment, and they needed a space to continue unpacking the conscious data lifecycle. They were literally asking for resources and ways to connect his concept to their daily work.
Because they heard an operational mechanism that clicked, and they just refused to let it get lost in the bureaucratic churn of a massive conference.
But I want to highlight something Rizzari points out here, because I think it speaks volumes about the current state of professional networking. Rizzari is the founder of a project called the SYRAG ecosystem.
Right.
And for you listening, SYRAG is essentially an architecture designed to transform abstract corporate knowledge into certified, verifiable answers. It actually manages the kind of data life cycles we're talking about. But Rizzari notes that the stakeholders reaching out to him weren't trying to buy his project.
That's the wild part.
Right. They weren't asking for a sales pitch or a vendor demonstration.
In a landscape like LinkedIn, where, let's be honest, nearly every interaction is a thinly veiled hustle or a lead generation tactic,
Oh, absolutely.
seeing a purely organic demand for shared dialogue is exceptionally rare. I mean, high-level UN delegates and corporate leaders are constantly bombarded by vendors trying to leverage a speaking gig into a software sale.
So true.
The fact that they reached out to build a community around a governance mechanism rather than to procure a tool proves there's a massive void in the current ecosystem.
A void that isolated consultation events just cannot fill. I mean, the event generated intense alignment around the idea of a trust perimeter, but the UN format didn't provide a container for that energy to live in afterward.
And Rizzari explicitly points this out as the primary lesson here. The network created after an event is ultimately more important than the event itself.
Wow.
The 3 minutes at the microphone were just the spark. But a spark is useless if it doesn't have a structured environment to catch and grow.
And because the UN didn't provide that container, Rizzari basically had to build it himself in real time to handle this influx of eager stakeholders.
Yeah, he had to pivot fast.
His response was highly practical and, interestingly, actively anti-commercial. He created a public LinkedIn group called the UN AI Governance Collaboration Forum.
And he designed it as an open space with a strict mandate against self-promotion.
No pitching allowed.
0. He recognized that the long-term value of the multi-stakeholder network he inadvertently catalyzed was far higher than any short-term commercial friction he could have introduced.
He prioritized the architecture of the conversation over his own product, which is so rare.
It is. But by neutralizing the commercial aspect, he allowed that organic hunger for continuity to flourish. It became this neutral vessel for international collaboration on data life cycles.
So what does this all mean? To really understand why this specific framework hit such a nerve in 2026, I looked at Rizzari's broader body of work.
Oh, good idea.
Yeah, if we zoom out and examine his other writings from the past few months, we see that this UN intervention wasn't an isolated thought experiment. It's part of a much larger argument he's been building.
About compliance, sovereignty, all of it.
Exactly. The context of his overarching philosophy is crucial here. He's authored pieces with titles like Navigating the 2026 AI Compliance Landscape, Sovereignty, Accountability, and the Black Box Problem. He writes extensively about why verification trumps trust, which ties directly back to how SYRAG functions.
Right.
But the concept that really stands out the most is his assertion that AI must stop performing certainty and start exposing reality.
And this raises an important question. I mean, the distinction between performing certainty and exposing reality is arguably the most vital technological challenge we face today.
Unpack that a bit.
Well, for the past several years, generative AI models have been engineered to sound authoritative. They perform certainty beautifully.
He sounds so confident.
Right. When you ask a system a question, it delivers a clean, highly articulate answer. The syntax is perfect. The tone is confident. It is literally designed to make you trust it implicitly.
But sounding confident has absolutely nothing to do with being factually or structurally accurate.
Exactly. And that is the core of the black box problem. A black box takes your prompt, does its mathematical magic in the dark, and hands you an output. Historically, users and even massive enterprise clients have just accepted that output because the performance of certainty is so convincing.
We just believe it.
We do. But what Rizzari is arguing, and what the UN delegates clearly recognized, is that the era of treating AI as a magical, infallible black box must end.
We can no longer afford to simply trust the output just because the neural network speaks with authority.
Verification trumps trust. You cannot verify a black box if you do not understand the life cycle of the data feeding it. Think about it. If an AI generates a report that influences global financial markets or, writes code for critical infrastructure,
Yeah, high-stakes stuff.
it is not enough that the model seems confident. We have to be able to audit the creation, usability, persistence, and reuse of the data that formed that specific output.
Because if you don't govern that entire data lifecycle, you don't have sovereignty over your own information. You don't have corporate accountability. You just have a machine that is exceptionally skilled at mimicking knowledge, while the actual reality of how it arrived at its conclusions remains totally obscured.
And the global community is exhausted by the performance of certainty. They are dealing with deepfakes, hallucinations, copyright infringement on a massive scale.
It's overwhelming.
It is. Abstract regulatory principles like AI should be fair and transparent have proven woefully inadequate.
Yeah, they don't actually mean anything in practice.
Exactly. The stakeholders at that UN consultation were hungry for a way to expose and govern the reality of how these systems operate at a structural level. The conscious data lifecycle gave them the mechanism to demand verifiable answers.
It is a profound shift in perspective, moving from just observing the machine to actively managing the ecosystem it relies on.
Absolutely.
So, to summarize the journey we've explored today, we started in a highly pressurized, rigidly structured room in Geneva, where a 3-minute time limit forced a speaker to abandon diplomatic jargon and deliver a purely operational thesis.
Right.
Rizzari introduced the concept of the conscious data lifecycle, arguing that AI governance must encompass the creation, usability, persistence, and reuse of data to establish a true trust perimeter.
And by focusing on the operational mechanics rather than just the final AI model, he bridged a massive communication gap between policymakers and technologists.
Which is incredible. That clarity sparked the spontaneous birth of a global multi-stakeholder network, a network that literally refused to let the conversation end when the 3-minute bell rang, proving that there is a deep organic demand for collaborative, verifiable AI governance. Governance that exposes reality rather than just performing certainty.
It demonstrates that impact is not measured by the amount of time you hold the microphone, but by the utility of the framework you leave behind.
Very well said.
And I want to leave you, the listener, with one final thought to consider. We have spent this deep dive analyzing global policy, the United Nations, international data compliance, all very high-level stuff.
Right.
But this dynamic applies directly to you. The next time you interact with an AI, whether you're asking it to analyze a spreadsheet, draft a sensitive email, or generate code, Do not just passively consume the output it hands you.
Think about the perimeter.
Ask yourself about your own role in the conscious data lifecycle. Are the specific prompts, the proprietary documents, and the personal information you just fed into that interface entering a new phase of creation? Are they structurally tagged for reuse in a future model?
Like, are they entering indefinite persistence on a server in a totally different legal jurisdiction?
Exactly. You are actively participating in this life cycle every time you hit enter. The 3 minutes might be up at the UN, but in your own digital footprint, the clock is always ticking. Who is governing your data right now?